Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Montesquieu Forum lecture on the problem of origins and foundings. Our guest lecturer today is Professor Richard Velkley, who is the Celia Scott Weatherhead Professor of Philosophy at Tulane University. Professor Velkley received his PhD 31 years ago from Penn State University in Pennsylvania. His professor was Richard Kennington, one of the most distinguished interpreters of modern philosophy of the 20th century. Professor Velkley is the author of several books. His first book, some 20 years ago, was Freedom in the End of Reason, a reflection on the influence of Rousseau on Kant's early philosophy and therefore all of Kant's philosophy. Second book, a collection of essays, Being After Rousseau, which is a collection of essays on the relationship of philosophy and culture, certain tensions that Rousseau bequeathed to late modern philosophy. In addition to essays on Rousseau in that volume, one finds essays on Kant, Schelling, and Heidegger. Professor Velkley has, in addition to these books, edited several books, including a wonderful recent collection of essays on freedom and the human person. He's written many essays on German idealism, on 20th century phenomenology. He has, I think it's fair to say, an international reputation as being an acute and meticulous philosopher. He's one of the most careful men I know in interpreting important texts. Today, Professor Velkley will be talking to us about Rousseau on the idea of origins and a defect in the natural origin in law in Rousseau's second discourse and part of the social contract. And also he tells me a little bit on the Emile. We're very proud to have Professor Velkley with us, so if you join me in welcoming to the lectern, please.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, Stuart. It's quite a pleasure and an honor to be here in this university where I see a number of people I know, and I'm enjoying this very beautiful room. So it's quite a pleasure to be here. I want to say at the start just a few things about Rousseau in case you need a little bit of information or background. Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, lived from 1712 to 1778. He was a Swiss-born philosopher who lived much of his life in France and wrote in French. And three of his major works, about which I'll say things today, are the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality of 1755, Emile or On Education, and Of the Social Contract, both published in 1762. You may know that Rousseau was an extraordinary figure, both as a thinker and as a character. And he was a figure with enormous influence, perhaps incomparable influence in the modern period for a single philosophic figure. His influence spread beyond the concern of philosophers to the wider public with the writing of novels, essays, plays, autobiographical works. He had an impact on European civilization which is hard to measure. A figure who had great importance for the French Revolution, for the rise of Romanticism, the tradition of German idealism. One can say in some ways, important ways, he influenced other major later figures such as Marx, Freud, Nietzsche. So, all right, that's a bit of salesmanship, one might say, to provide a bit of context. And I want to say now that the primary topic of the paper is actually the rhetoric of Rousseau as it relates to certain problems he's considering. My point is that one has to have some sense of how Rousseau writes and his rhetoric to understand his work. Now, I'm dealing with, as Stuart mentioned, comments on 3 texts, so the things I say about these texts are going to be a bit compressed, and I hope you will still extract useful things from what I say, and then we can have a discussion period later where I might amplify and clarify things you want to ask about. Now, I intend to show the connection between 2 things in Rousseau's thought, 2 very central things, which seem at first to be unrelated. The account of the state of nature in the second discourse, the discourse on the origins of inequality, and the account of the original legislator in the social contract. Now, they seem unrelated since Rousseau describes the state of nature, that is, the earliest human condition before the existence of political life, as pre-social and even pre-rational. And he presents the action of the original legislator, who has a crucial role for the establishment of civil society. He characterizes that action as presupposing that humans have left the state of nature, and thus they have sociality and rationality, but in a very imperfect way. Now, I wish by this topic to advance our understanding of Rousseau's philosophical intentions. I shall bluntly characterize his intentions, at least a major part of them, by saying that Rousseau has 2 primary audiences. A large audience to whom he addresses a less philosophical teaching I call the piety of natural goodness, and a much smaller audience of potential philosophers to whom he addresses his most fundamental thought. Now, to sum up now the conclusions of my paper in advance, I'll say this: the state of nature and the original legislator, they seem to be unrelated if one holds the view that the original state of nature is free of defect or wholly good, according to the piety of natural goodness. But one can see that the 2 topics are deeply related if one questions that piety and uncovers Rousseau's genuine thought on the defect of the original natural state. Now, that is to say, one needs to question the surface of Rousseau's benign account of the natural state by note its deliberately abstractive and even fictional features. Rousseau's deeper thought about original nature maintains that human nature from the start has certain incorrigible tendencies standing in the way of any large-scale attainment of happiness. If one turns to the original legislator, his task of founding a people is necessary due to these tendencies, and the realization of that task is ultimately made impossible by the same tendencies. And, of course, I'll describe these soon. But Rousseau, in the social contract, is relatively quiet about these tendencies and only indirectly discloses that they are incorrigible, so that his stance might lead one to think that the legislator's task can be fulfilled. Human nature allows it. Now, a major part of his account in the social contract, namely the general will, which I'll describe soon, it abstracts from these tendencies. The second discourse describes these problematic tendencies quite openly, but the surface argument presents them as only acquired. And although the discourse gives a bleak account of political life as originating in injustice and as evolving into the modern European world, which is miserable and ripe for tyranny, this account of the origin of political life, when read superficially, can give rise to hopes for radical reform or revolution, since the harmful tendencies seem not to belong to man's original nature. Now, this is how Rousseau was often read and how he still is often read. I'll get to what the tendencies are shortly. But let me make a comment first on how to read Rousseau. We are helped in appreciating Rousseau's mode of writing by this quotation from a preface to a second letter to Charles Borde. I quote now, "I did not want to say everything in order to make sure that everything got a hearing. I developed my ideas successively and always but to a small number of readers. Often I went to great trouble to try and condense into a single sentence, a single line, a single word tossed off by chance, as if by chance, the result of a long chain of reflections. The majority of readers may have often found my discourses poorly structured and almost entirely disjointed, for want of perceiving the trunk, of which I showed only the branches. But that was enough for those capable of understanding, and I never wanted to speak to the others." End of quotation. And Rousseau speaks here of an art of writing that one might call a revealing through withholding, which fashions the arguments around an elusive trunk or core principle, which is both indicated by and obscured by the manifest branches, the most accessible propositions of the writing. That elusive trunk, in Rousseau's thought, is the root cause of our human dividedness, which we tend not to see, and which indeed we would rather not see, as we would rather see ourselves and the world according to ideas of how we wish to be, rather than how we are. But this tendency to see ourselves as other than as we are, or to be self-ignorant, is in fact very deeply connected with the dividedness that we overlook, the root cause thereof. Now, the root of human misery, as well as of the overlooking of the root, is the imagination. I'll read now a quotation. "It is imagination which extends for us the measure of the possible, whether for good or bad, and which consequently nourishes the desires by the hope of satisfying them. But the object which at first appeared to be at hand flees more quickly than it can be pursued. When one believes that one has reached it, it transforms and reveals itself in the distance ahead of us." End of quotation. Now, imagination is not merely a power of copying what is sensibly present, but is a creative power of extending our ideas and therewith our desires beyond what is actual toward what is merely possible, and in many cases never actual or even actualizable. Rousseau says the real world has its limits, the imaginary world is infinite. Now, Rousseau's writing exploits this power by presenting unattainable objects as though they were possible. It excites hopes about achieving goals that the same writing shows cannot be achieved if it is read more closely. The reader must take a step towards self-knowledge in the recognition of the role that imagination plays in following the lead of Rousseau's thought, as his writing both raises and then dashes certain hopes. In coming to this self-recognition, the reader uncovers the elusive trunk of Rousseau's thought, the fundamental problem of human life, and the cause of human weakness. I give a quote. "From what does man's weakness come? From inequality between his strengths and his desires. It is our passions that make us weak, because to satisfy them we would need more strength than nature gave us." End quote. Our passions, however, are grounded in imagination, or in its creation of the gulf between the actual and the imaginary possible. Thereby it gives birth to all the pains that make us truly unhappy, since apart from bodily pains and the remorse of conscience, all our ills are imaginary. But the key to the elusive trunk is a rarely stated addendum. Imagination is a natural and not an acquired faculty. Now, often the surface of Rousseau's writing is optimistic, as he offers some hopeful visions of addressing the fundamental problem by eliminating or ameliorating the excess of desire over power, or by preventing the excess from arising. The equality of desire and power he seems to present as an actual condition. It once existed and can be regained through the right educational and political institutions. The second discourse describes it as the original human condition, which was lost through the unintended acquisition of factitious desires, whereby individual powers cease to be adequate to the satisfaction of expanded desire. New bonds of human dependence were consequently forged, and originally equal and free individuals became subject to a social order characterized by inequalities of wealth and power. The educational regime of Émile would forestall the development of the enslaving passions, above all amour propre, pride, vanity, self-regard, in the maturing individual. The intent is to create a human being who remains a natural man in society, one whose powers remain equal to his desires. The social contract would overcome the conventional inequalities of social life and rectify the disproportion between the individual's forces and the forces of society by means of the institution of something called the general will, in which each person alienates his individual will to the will of the united people, the whole. There is the question here whether this arrangement truly addresses the problem of human dividedness, which emerges when man becomes a social being. The citizen is a denatured being who must consult reason and law rather than appetite and whim, and who therefore is still divided between reason and appetite. As to overcoming that fundamental self-dividedness, Rousseau in Émile does not conceal from the reader the difficulties of his educational project, even though it is still often missed. But he does say, "I show that the goal must be set. I do not say that it can be reached." And in a footnote, he goes further. "I will be told that I too dream, and I agree. But I give my dreams as dreams, which others are not careful to do, leaving it to the reader to find out whether they contain something useful for people who are awake." In a letter, Rousseau writes, "You say quite correctly that it is impossible to produce an Émile, but I cannot believe that you take the book that carries this name for a true treatise on education. It is rather a philosophical work on the book, on this principle advanced by the author in other writings, that man is naturally good." Now, furthermore, Rousseau's account of Émile's development from infancy to adolescence contains several intimations that the original nature of every human being contains the seeds of its own corruption. Among these seeds, those of amour propre have the profoundest implications. Although Rousseau asserts there is no natural spirit of domination, and nature is not the immediate cause of ideas of domination and empire, he also notes the existence, I quote, of a disposition to fury, spite, and anger in small children. And he says he became convinced that the sentiment of the just and the unjust were innate in the heart of man upon seeing a child turn red with rage after being struck by a nurse. The child is capable of perceiving the manifest intention to harm him, which he can distinguish from the pain inflicted by an inanimate being. Thus, the adults on whom the child is dependent should, as much as possible, conceal their wills in aiding, instructing, rewarding, and punishing, and make it seem that a child interacts only with things or nature. For it takes only one experience of being opposed by a human will to activate the sentiment of righteous indignation. But keeping that sentiment dormant, which is the project, requires elaborate, indeed inconceivable artifice. Just as necessary for Rousseau's project, and just as impossible, is the prevention of the desire to imitate, the foundation of which, he says, comes from the desire always to be transported outside ourselves, which is clearly connected with imagination. If Émile is properly raised, he will remain within himself, without striving to effect what lies beyond his immediate powers. Accordingly, Rousseau says, if I succeed in my enterprise, Emile will surely not have the imitative desire. But he also concedes the naturalness of the desire and observes that as soon as our faculties are put into action, imagination, the most active of all, is awakened and outstrips them. Now here is the crucial addendum to the fundamental problem. Imagination, with its capacity to create superfluous desires that exceed our powers, is natural. Now Rousseau just seems to contradict himself. Well, he understood what he was doing in preceding it that way. Well, what then is the practical efficacy of the dream of natural education? It discloses the source of human unhappiness and underlines the need to restrain and minimize the harm of the human tendencies. The worst of our ills, Rousseau does assert, are of our own making, by our failure to educate properly through neglect of the natural good, or the idea of original equality of desire and power. Yet, nature itself already lays the ground for the loss of that equality. For Rousseau says, man alone has superfluous faculties. That is, the faculties in the human do not simply serve the natural good of self-preservation and create other unnatural ends not conducive to contentment and well-being. And thus the opening statement of Book 1 of Emile, famous statement, everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things. That statement is only a statement of piety, wherein the impossible is viewed as possible. The possibility of maintaining, preserving natural goodness. It, however, has a literal truth in the ironic sense if the author is taken to be Rousseau himself. So let us now turn to the second discourse, where Rousseau offers another indication about how he is to be read. Between the preface and part 1, he supplies a remark, avertissement, that alerts the reader to the importance of notes placed at the end of the essay. Now he tells one that they sometimes stray so wide of the subject that they are not good to read together with the text, and that in the text I tried my best to follow the straightest road. He says it will require courage for some readers to start over again and amuse themselves the second time with beating the bushes and trying to peruse the notes. Thus he is saying that a combination of intellectual seriousness, or the capacity to seek and face difficult truths, and playfulness, or the ability to grasp irony and indirection on the part of an author, are needed for fully understanding Rousseau's writing. Now, Rousseau says that other readers lacking these qualities, that is, less philosophical readers, will experience little harm in not reading the notes at all. So one can expect that they are the majority of readers. Now, the second discourse presents a vivid image of original man, which no one forgets, and perhaps everyone knows something about it. It shows a being hardly different from other animals. The first human will begin with purely animal functions, Rousseau says. To perceive and to sense will be his first state, which he will have in common with other animals. It is said of this animal that his soul, which nothing stirs, yields itself to the sole sentiment of its present existence, with no idea of the future, however near it may be. Now that's one very prominent description. Man as mere animal has an inert imagination, with no thought of anything beyond what he senses immediately. His desires are limited, his passions non-existent. But wait, the text itself places a contradiction within this picture. Rousseau says, the statement that man is pure animal would be, is immediately corrected by another assertion that original man is rather compensated for the instinct he perhaps lacks. Humans, having perhaps no instinct that belonged to them, observe and imitate the industry of other animals and raise themselves to the level of the beast's instincts. The lack of instinct forces early humans to be industrious and to live by observation of other beings. From the start, they must live outside themselves and cannot dwell solely in the present, savoring the feeling of merely existing. The lack of instinct is the negative condition for something Rousseau calls perfectibility, the faculty which, with the aid of circumstances, successively develops all the others. Through this capacity, humans expand their physical powers as well as the imaginative and cognitive powers, which in turn extend desires beyond primary needs. Now, Rousseau says it would be sad for us to be forced to agree that this faculty is the source of all man's miseries, and imagination, again, is at the very heart of what he's calling perfectibility. But here sounds the leitmotif of the pious music of natural goodness, that nature itself is not responsible for human ills, and only through misfortune does the human depart from natural simplicity. Yet, look more closely. Nature's original provision for man predisposes the human toward misery by not including among its gifts sufficient instinctual knowledge for even basic self-preservation, thus making necessary the invention of arts. Nature has also endowed humans with the power of invention itself, so that nature supplies both the occasion and the means for the ascent or descent into an endlessly problematic existence. Rousseau, in fact, never tries to exhibit, much less explain, the emergence of the human from mere animal. The earliest being he considers is already greatly different from other animals. Well, just how different? Rousseau says that the earliest human has erect posture, the use of hands, and is directing his gaze over the whole of nature with his eyes sweeping the vast expanse of heaven. Now, clearly a being that can survey the whole of nature is not one whose thoughts are limited to immediate needs and sensations. And one can further surmise that such surveying is not pursued solely in a mood of tranquil wonder and reflection. There is much in the heavens as well as in earth to bewilder and terrify the first beings who survey them. Now, Rousseau's procedure is first to implant in our minds the indelible image of the human as we would wish to be, perfectly equal to itself, undisturbed by unnecessary desires, undivided and whole. Then subtly he undermines this image, revealing it as unsustainable. The human as having the potential at the start to be divided and unequal to itself must be radically different from other beings that cannot be unequal to themselves. Rousseau exploits the image of primitive human self-unity to disclose to us what we long to be, and also, for those who can follow his argument, to show its impossibility. Not all readers will read closely enough to gain this instruction in self-knowledge. Most will remain confident that Rousseau holds that original man was truly whole, and that he teaches that recovery of that wholeness is possible for us as well. The majority of readers will be seduced by the pious music of natural goodness, or if not seduced, and perhaps even contemptuous of it, they will still believe that Rousseau was seduced by it. One thus sees that Rousseau deviates from the straightest road that he described. The notes show how Rousseau's thought even wanders off into darker and unsettling thickets. Perhaps most revealing is Note 10, presenting some travelers' reports of sightings of anthropoid creatures in distant lands. Although the travelers believe they have seen non-human beings, since their outward form is unlike the human and they do not speak, Rousseau spots in their reports evidence that some of these beings might be genuinely natural humans. He sees signs of the faculty of perfectibility, rather oddly, in a form of passive behavior, which the travelers interpret as mere stupidity. These creatures, a species of primate called pongos, fail to push embers into a dying fire to keep it going. Now, Rousseau explains this as the effect of boredom or tedium, ennui, and as an act of will, volonté. In other words, the passive behavior evinces an intentional act peculiar to the human. Perhaps this is a Rousseauian joke, but it seems to have a serious purpose. After all, could not any failure to act be explained in this way? Rousseau's point seems to be that this seemingly passive act should not be considered in isolation, as the travelers regard it, but must be interpreted in the light of other aspects of the pongo's behavior. For the elusive essence of the human, the perfectible imagination, is not immediately visible. Now, turning to the text, Rousseau relates human intention or will to the capacity for general ideas, which is a capacity to apprehend what is not present to us, the genus of things, as definitive for present particulars. Now, Rousseau says the pongo's possession of that capacity is indicated by three features of their behavior. They kill humans who stare at them, they bury their own dead, and they practice an art of making roofs out of branches. These behaviors point respectively to self-awareness, awareness of mortality, and the power of invention. And together these suggest a distinctively human awareness of time, the imagination of the possible future, which underlies the grasping of the non-present involved in perfectibility. The human capacity to compare the present to a possible future is the condition for thinking in terms of kinds of things. You know, tree as opposed to just this thing here, a tree. Since the thought of the kind as linking present and non-present is more than the sensing of similarity between things that are present. But now one is again talking about foresight, which Rousseau called the root of all human misery. This capacity, however, cannot be discerned immediately from a single act of a being. It emerges from an ensemble of acts, which are recognizable, to another being capable of interpreting an ensemble of acts, because it too possesses perfectibility, so that a human can recognize when considering the ensemble of the actions. All the same, the traveler's reports show how humanness still hides from humans, since humans characteristically are self-ignorant and less than fully conscious of their own capacities. And the same self-ignorance characterizes those readers who, as travelers in Rousseau's strange landscape of early nature, make the error of accepting the text's image of the subhuman animal as the true account of the original human. They, for whom true humanness is a foreign country, miss its complexity. Now, I turn to the social contract, to discuss another instance of Rousseau's art of mise en scène, which encourages the reader to overlook the true conditions of human nature and to regard what is impossible as though it were possible. The work has the subtitle, Principles of Political Right. This is important, for the title does not speak of natural right. For according to Rousseau, there is no natural right grounded in the consciousness of man in the original state of nature, as there is in the thought of Hobbes and Locke. Natural man, being pre-social and without a concept of what is his own, has no concept of right. Rousseau's account of the just political order takes its bearings by something superior to natural right, namely the idea of human self-unity that precedes the self-dividedness inseparable from social life. And again, this is the belief in natural goodness. The just political order is designed to solve a problem that seems, however, inherently insoluble. Starting with men as they are, that is, as socially corrupted, to make laws as they can be, that is, laws that recreate original equality. This order must be recreated by means that belong only to the corrupt social order, the means of law. All law is conventional. Furthermore, its force depends, Rousseau says, on a sanctioning by the sacred. Quote, "The social order is a sacred right, which provides the basis of all others. Yet this right does not come from nature. It is therefore founded on convention. The problem is to know what those conventions are." Well, which conventions can restore original nature? Certainly no convention can recreate the actual radical independence of humans in the natural state. Instead, conventions can institute an equality approaching original equality. But these conventions require the complete loss of natural freedom. That loss is what seems to call for the superhuman sanction. Now, Rousseau makes only two references to original nature in this work. The first is the famous opening of Book 1. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. One believes himself the other's master, and yet is more a slave than he. How did this change come about? I do not know. What can make it legitimate? I believe I can solve this question. If the passage refers only to the birth of the individual and not the beginning of the species, it perpetrates a manifest falsehood. Humans at birth are radically weak, hence radically dependent on others and unfree. However, if one takes the remark as pointing to the species beginning, Rousseau tells actually a lie, since here he claims not to know what he described in detail in the second discourse, namely the story of the human loss of original freedom. Now, admittedly, that account in the second discourse had hypothetical features, but Rousseau's simple "I do not know" here in this context points to something striking about the treatment of social life, origin of social life, of the social contract. It abstracts from the problem of the perfectible powers, crucially imagination. Now, let us recall that the second discourse describes the development of the human powers as an unpremeditated, imagination-inspired expansion of thought and desire, resulting in mutual dependence to satisfy enlarged desires. As the state of nature deteriorates, dependence among humans increases, and conventional inequalities arise. According to the story, to prevent a bad situation from growing worse, the poor agree to a contract with the rich under duress, which ratifies the de facto inequalities. Human blindness and unrestrained passion thus produce a defective original social order that validates the loss of freedom and equality. Now that is in the second discourse. The second reference to original nature and of the social contract entirely abstracts from that account just given, describing an act which is an intelligent response to unspecified obstacles. Consider the passage. I assume that men, having reached a point where obstacles that interfere with their preservation in the state of nature prevail by their resistance over the forces which each individual can muster to maintain himself in that state. Now, not being able to engender new forces alone, men were compelled, Rousseau says, to form by aggregation a sum of forces that might prevail over those unnamed obstacles and their resistance. Now, here Rousseau ignores the discourse's account of history, in which the obstacles arise from thought and imagination, and thus he obscures the extent to which perfectibility is the source of the problem that perfectibility must solve. He therefore makes it seem as though natural man enters into the social order through a calculation which fully serves his interest. Quite unlike the Discourse's story that blind self-enslavement marks the entry into social life. Now, in Social Contract, Rousseau writes as though each human being in the natural state solves a profound philosophical problem. I quote, "To find a form of association that will defend and protect the persons and goods of each associate, and by means of which each, uniting with all, will nevertheless obey only himself and remain as free as before." It's such a difficult problem, it's very hard to understand the formulation, but this is what human beings, he says, did when they entered the social condition. The solution is the creation of the general will, wherein each alienates himself and all of his rights to the community, establishing a whole of equal legislators, so that each, by giving himself to all, gives himself to no one, and in that sense remains free. Now, somehow one must reconcile Rousseau's claim that the clauses of this contract are everywhere tacitly admitted and recognized with the fact of universal inequality and servitude. How often do human beings actually make the reflective step into citizenship described by this contract? Now, Rousseau himself provides grounds for doubting the reality of this accomplishment. He observes that after the contract is formed, each person continues to have a particular interest as a naturally independent being and is inclined to enjoy the rights of a citizen without fulfilling the duties of a subject. The citizen tends to regard the notion of the moral person of the state, the united will of the whole, as just a being of reason. Accordingly, the sovereign, which is the general will, must find means to ensure the fidelity of its members, who shall be, in the famous phrase, forced to be free. The difficulty of conceiving the entry into this lawful order of the general will is magnified by Rousseau's famous statement that this transition from the state of nature to the civil state produces a remarkable change in man by substituting justice for instinct in his conduct and endowing his actions with the morality they previously lacked. Only then does man consult his reason before listening to his inclinations. It is, in fact, then the social condition which is changing human beings so that they can reflect and make intelligent decisions. Well, whether the entrance into civil society has actually effected such a change in most human beings has already been put in doubt by statements I quoted. But there is a more serious conceptual problem. Human beings would need to have already undergone this transformation in order to make the reflective choice of forming the contract. Only in the condition of civil society does the great change in man occur, which is required for creating civil society. Rousseau says it was the happy moment of entering into the civil society that out of a stupid and bounded animal made an intelligent being and a man. Again, there the state of nature is characterized as, in the mythical form, as pure animal. How can a being that has no notion of citizenship choose to become a citizen? Now I come to my concluding passage. Rousseau openly calls into question the entire account just given of the formation of the general will when he turns to the theme of the original lawgiver. Okay. In this chapter, Rousseau underlines how helpless the people are in the founding of themselves as a people, founding themselves as a people. And I give a quote. For a nascent people to be capable of appreciating sound maxims of politics and of following the fundamental rules of reason of state, the effect would have to become the cause. The social spirit, which is the work of the institution, would have to preside over the institution itself. And men would have to be prior to laws, what they ought to become by means of them. Now, thus stating the difficulty of the original institution of civil society, Rousseau appeals to an original lawgiver, a great soul whose founding of a people is, he says, the true miracle. At this point, one learns how human beings undergo the change required for the reflective choice of citizenship. I quote, "Anyone who dares to institute a people must feel capable of, so to speak, changing human nature, of transforming each individual who by himself is a perfect and solitary whole into part of a larger whole, of substituting a partial and moral existence for the independent and physical existence we have all received from nature." End of quotation. The original lawgiver is the figure who must effect this change. Now, Rousseau does not take back the view that once the people exist as a civil association, their united will is the true legislator. But he says that the people are a blind multitude and lack the foresight to frame the original laws they live under. The people have good will but lack understanding. On the other hand, exceptional individuals with insight tend not to subordinate their interests to the public good. Hence the need for an extraordinary individual combining understanding with a benevolent will. Rousseau describes a highly improbable, if not impossible, being. I quote, "A superior intelligence who saw all of men's passions and experienced none of them, who had no relation to our nature and yet knew it thoroughly, whose happiness was independent of us and who was nevertheless willing to care for ours." Now, herewith Rousseau points to the analysis of the fundamental human problem, that the advance of thought and imagination inevitably brings corruption in its train. And somehow the original legislator, you say, escapes that problem. The original legislator must combine maximal intelligence about human nature with maximal independence from human passion. For his task is to accomplish an end which political life otherwise cannot accomplish, to transform reason as governed by passion into reason as law-giving. The lawgiver must begin where most human beings, given their nature, can only end. His nature must transcend the limits of the political and even of human nature if he is to ground the new order of law. To achieve this end, he acts as a ruler, and yet he cannot engage in political rule with its corrupting effects. Rousseau writes, "Thus two apparently incompatible things come together in the work of the legislator, in undertaking beyond human force, and to execute it an authority that is nil." Now, although such a being transcends the limits of the human, the legislator must exist if the just political order transcends the limits of the human. Yet the ideal order and its realization must be imagined so that these limits can come into view. The whole argument rests on the trunk of Rousseau's philosophy, which he seldom directly states, but to which all the branches of his writings point. And I need to stop there, although there's much room to explain more, given time.
Professor Velkley has asked me to field questions, and he will answer them. This is an intellectual division of labor. So,
Can Rousseau be read either as can Rousseau be read either as a celebration of liberty and the rights of man, which condemns all forms of absolute arbitrary government, or as a recipe for the abolition of human liberties and the absorption of the individual in the sovereign collective and general will and so forth? Can Rousseau be read either way?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That takes one back to the, well, the still heated debate of is Rousseau a Democrat or an egalitarian? I mean, a totalitarian. Well, my answer is he's neither, really. I mean, if one looks at the social contract, in fact, he says a pure democracy is in fact an impossibility because there must be a distinction of functions between a legislative power and an executive power, and the legislative power really cannot undertake for itself the task of executing the law, because it will be the partial then executor of its own law. And no, there needs to be a distinction, and Rousseau in fact says as far as the executive is concerned, that can take a number of forms, monarchical, aristocratic, or or something maybe in the form of a council that involves many people, but will not a pure democracy. But there's much more to the matter than this, because Rousseau is actually really quite skeptical about whether the order that he outlines in the social contract is realizable at all, on more than one level. It's requirements of this order cannot be met by a modern European state, since this kind of community requires a small form of association, a small form of community, and in which all individuals have some knowledge of one another, something like a certain account of a polis, an ancient polis. A modern large nation, Rousseau thought was likely to become a tyranny, and he wasn't in fact writing a recipe for the overcoming of modern political orders to replace them with the kind of community he describes in the general social contract. Now, I mean, and I mentioned, other ways in which you can see difficulties about thinking of it as possible. So, but on the other hand, it is the case that Rousseau was a sharp critic of the aristocracy, of the existing order, of monarchical rule as it existed. I mean, he could understand some forms of ameliorative reform, and but what was his deepest intent? As I understand his deepest intent, it was not to bring about a revolution in modern society, and it was rather to create a new way of thinking, a new understanding of the human situation and the human problems that, well, to the extent it could be addressed well by most people, would be realized for the most part on the private level or in the family. And his book on education, points to the importance of giving attention to education within the family, because he's not describing, the creation of large educational institutions, and to the satisfactions of the life of the family. He celebrates the possibilities, I would have to say that not without some reservations, but the possibilities of a harmonious marriage. He wrote the most popular novel in Europe in the time, Julie, or the Nouvelle Eloise, which is an account of a virtuous pair that overcomes temptation and obstacles to discover a truly virtuous form of love with the assistance of some wise people and their elders, among their elders. And Rousseau was certainly seeking some kind of change of thinking and of sentiment. And why? I mean, I guess I have to say something now which is absolutely fundamental. I left out. Christianity's dying. He's thinking in terms of of something to succeed right? The existing form of Christianity, which, furthermore, he sees it as intrinsically deeply flawed. And what I'm calling the natural piety of goodness is the heart of a new kind of piety. It's a piety that focuses upon an understanding of nature as good, as that which we revere, that which gives human beings a sense of purpose and fulfillment. And but of course, at the same time, Rousseau is subtly pointing to difficulties in this piety. So I think on another level, he's claiming that, for potential philosophers, I say, he expects his writing to help those to lead a life that's, wholly free of illusions and of piety, and to find a satisfaction of that sort. But he doesn't want to destroy, clearly, the possibility of the development of that piety. Which a famous statement of it, by the way, is the profession of the faith of the Savoyard vicar in the Emile. I don't know if that helped with your question, though. Okay. I didn't say whether he's a totalitarian, but I think implicitly he's not a totalitarian either, because insofar as that social order is not a recipe.
You seem to say Rousseau defines us as the animal that treats the impossible as if it were possible.
That's at the root of heart of imagination, yes.
Yeah. Which seems like both a tragic and a comic description simultaneously.
No.
Does the philosopher, because you constantly distinguish between philosophers and everybody else, does the philosopher fall within that category or outside of it? Does he too treat the impossible as if it were possible?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, surely Rousseau does as a writer. That's part of the you might say, the pedagogy or the rhetoric of his writing, which is to, he's of course an extraordinarily talented writer who makes use of literary devices, makes use of the imagination to convey, philosophic thought. So, but I think there's actually, maybe the harder part of the answer is what about Rousseau's own case, or the case of the philosopher? And one sees that Rousseau doesn't find that, if we take his own case, that he simply transcends this problem, right? He acquires an understanding that gives him greater freedom from, the prevailing ways in which we imagine the impossible. But the Reveries of the Solitary Walker is a really helpful work for showing how Rousseau is a being that has imagination. His imagination tends to, create lots of difficulties for him. But he also shows, though, how one philosophically, as it were, learns how to, you might say, exploit and, in some sense, manipulate this intrinsic human characteristic to make a life that's more pleasant, to make a life that it has a greater a genuine independence. But the whole writing is a very interesting story about, you see, about a kind of the controlled imaginative ways of shaping his life so that the harmful effects of imagination can, be transformed.
Hi.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering exactly what should we make of the fact that Rousseau signed the social contract as a citizen of Geneva,
Mm-hmm.
and claims in the third paragraph of Book 1 that he was born a citizen of a free state. It seems to me that this touches upon the problem of men being prior to laws, what laws would attempt to make them. So I'm wondering what exactly it means
That's a fine question. I think. Well, first of all, one I think has to take his praise of Geneva with some skepticism, right? And Rousseau doesn't draw attention to defects in the civic life, civic order of Geneva, which undoubtedly he saw, which he indicates elsewhere. After all, he himself was banished from Geneva. I mean, his conception of, neither his conception of philosophy nor even of piety is compatible with Calvinism, with the traditional Calvinism. Instead, it seems to be indicating a problem. He was born a citizen in this form of highly imperfect political life, which would, of course, tend to shape his thought and his character. And yet, he also characterizes himself as a unique human being who somehow, of course, there's no real explanation, but somehow had a more of a natural spontaneity or a freedom from the constraints of convention than most other human beings. So I think really it's a rather contrived document. That's really what I have to say about that letter of dedication. But I mean, I may not be missing a really important point you're making, but
I suppose I could put it otherwise. By asking whether he's granted himself a retrospective glance at a moment that could not have been appraised as one involving citizenship when it occurred. What does it mean for him to return to his birth as the birth of a citizen in light of his philosophical reflections on politics? And I suppose that this can be brought to bear upon attention that's manifest throughout, but especially in the first pages, at the local or the parochial and the universal. In what sense is he bringing them together and showing that they can't be fully reconciled?
through the letter of dedication, he's showing they can't be reconciled. I think what he's pointing to really implicitly is that by a rare stroke of good fortune, he has escaped that problem, right? I mean, this makes him akin to the legislator, and yet we have to say Rousseau doesn't quite fit the description of the legislator, right? But he's akin to the legislator. In fact, his own activity as writer is akin to that of the legislator. And the legislator is described as a kind of miracle. So I think that's how I would try to respond.
You stated in your opening that Rousseau had a pretty large influence on the French Revolution, and I think especially in the philosophy of Maximilian Robespierre, especially. Could you maybe touch on the relationship between the two, and how much of Robespierre's philosophy was actually Robespierre's, and how much was actually Rousseau's? And did you really get it right, or where did you go wrong?
Well, I'm not an authority on Robespierre, but there's very good writing on this by a French scholar, François Furet, who writes on how Rousseau was misinterpreted by Robespierre and other French revolutionary leaders who created institutions which really did not at all fit what he describes as the model, and the social contract. And of course, they overlooked really his reservations about attempting a practical realization at all. But the misunderstandings were abound, you see. Well, one could say, well, they were inspired by the spirit of Rousseau, which certainly in some senses right. That one can't deny. I mean, but the spirit of Rousseau allows for a number of human responses, and some of them involve misunderstanding. But undoubtedly, though, it was Rousseau's intent to make human beings aware in the modern period of their what we later call alienation. To make his writing did have the effect of creating a profound sense of dissatisfaction, of longing for something different, right, from the existing political and social order. And undoubtedly, therefore, he has a real contribution. It made a contribution to the revolution, but then Rousseau thought he was thinking in terms of satisfying this longing more in terms of what I'm calling the natural piety of goodness than in the creation of a modern European state, something like what he describes in the social contract. Yes.
If I followed your remarks correctly, there's been a sense that Christianity is deteriorating or belief is decaying or something along those lines. And that the original legislator is in fact impossible, and it's an imaginary figure to an extent. Rousseau also said in the very beginning of the second discourse that many philosophers have imagined the natural state or the state of nature, however none, and that made him question whether it indeed existed.
Right.
In why this imaginary enterprise. It seems that there is another fiction produced, or means what we see in the what, but even the state of nature itself is a way into perhaps understanding the human condition and introducing a certain piety, whether it be fictional or for whichever purposes that may be produced, but the state of nature itself in his writing is it also to an extent to be seen as a fiction.
Well, the version of it in which there is a being that possesses actually complete wholeness and no inequality of itself with itself, that is not realizable. Okay. Now, nevertheless, Rousseau is saying that he's giving an analysis of the sources of human misery in the description of how imagination multiplies human desire and leads to the pursuit of what is impossible. So he certainly wants to he wants to further a kind of enlightenment, right? Okay, whereby our understanding of our life will be quite different from now on. There will be, an understanding of how amour propre, human dependence, inequality are these evils from which we should try to gain some kind of distance. Now, he thinks for the most part it will be easiest to pursue that goal if you actually follow another illusion. Is that helping?
May I take the liberty of slightly reformulating the question?
Sure.
Discussing it a little further.
Mm-hmm.
One could write an essay imagining the impossible, how to understand the human situation while both trying and lying. And so you have these two idealizations at the beginning and at the end, with the state of nature and the legislator, in these two important philosophical works. It suggests the possibility that for Rousseau, such imagining is essential to the philosophical enterprise.
Yes.
So maybe the question at least I'd like to ask is imagination, in the way in which Rousseau uses it by propagating of various illusions, necessary to philosophy, important to philosophy? If it is, to whatever extent, why is it significant to philosophy?
Yeah. No, it is. It certainly is. Well, it is part of our nature. Rousseau is clear about how it is part of his nature, a very powerful part of his nature, and therefore one has to understand the power of it. One has to understand its mechanism, understand how it works, in order to gain a kind of power over it, which is essential to the philosophic life, right? In other words, one has to see that one is, striving after this and that, which seem manifestly desirable and possible, and one has to discover the aporia. I mean, in this sense, it has a kinship with Socratic, philosophizing, which proceeds through, starting with our assumptions, not immediately dismissing them, not immediately just calling them into doubt, but seeing how they proceed and how they run ultimately into aporia. And only in that way, as we live through the aporia, can we find our way beyond it. So Rousseau did have clearly passions and imagination, although he thought he was also gifted with a certain way of, as contradictory as it sounds, of being free of them. Now, I mean, really what I think is fundamental there is he had philosophic insight, and it wasn't just a matter of a fluke or, but the philosophic insight, in fact, he describes as being acquired with some difficulty. So you might compare, I mean, even the philosopher then has to have some education of the soul in this way. You might compare the role of the original legislator in the social contract to, say, Glaucon's, expectation and hope that the city in speech, which Socrates and his friends are describing, can be actualized, which Socrates dashes, right? And that preparing him, whether he in fact goes there or not, one might doubt, but preparing him for moving into a more philosophical understanding, right? So yes, I think it's essential, and
philosophy.
that
is, if you, by way of comparison, if one picks up almost any contemporary journal of philosophy, one will see philosophy proceeding other than beginning with an idealized possible situation.
No, sure.
Certain things out. So would one want to say there's something about defective so practiced, or is it another way of practicing it, or is there something that Rousseau and others who invoke some kind of idealization, whether it be the book of Genesis or other modern philosophers, have an insight into as to either how philosophy should proceed or how it can proceed best? It's not obvious that should be the way in which it ought to be conducted.
Well, but the other way, I suppose you mean the characteristic way of arguing in journals and so forth, well, overlooks the thinker as human being, and the need for the education of the human being. In other words, it's overlooking the fundamental characteristic of philosophy as a way of life, rather than just the learning of arguments and the drawing of logical conclusions, which you can you can learn to do skillfully, but it doesn't necessarily improve the quality of your soul or your the nature of your passions or it may not assist you in acquiring the most important clarity about the larger questions about life. So yes, it's a very important pedagogical point within philosophy, and I mean, Rousseau gives certain examples of it in the Reveries, where, he finds that, in fact, he finds himself assisted actually by circumstances that were unplanned to become free of certain powerful passions which were limiting him. And which is quite interesting because it means that Rousseau, the philosopher, found that he could not do all of it simply by himself, that there was this element of helpful circumstance. Yeah. Yeah.
Should we come away from this thinking about Rousseau as a profound pessimist or, in some sense, a true optimist? By that I mean, in one sense, what you presented is if you come to really understand the impossibility of these projects, one could go into despair. On the other hand, seem to suggest that those, at least of the philosophical sort, that are able to understand truth in the nature are able to do something about their nature, their circumstance. And is there a sense in which they are the hardy band of a new future? That they will go forward and do something, create something? Or is this simply a process that has to be recaptured by every individual in every generation?
Yes, that's an important question. Well, first, I agree with you right away with your first statement, or what I think you were suggesting, that is, Rousseau does not mean the outcome of this to be simply pessimistic, right? I mean, the disillusioning is an act of understanding, not merely a deflationary moment, but an act of understanding that results in greater freedom. Gaining insight about oneself, self-knowledge, understanding the role of imagination and passion in how one lives. That's a genuine advance. That's a form of insight, which Rousseau doesn't expect to be the source of despair for those who have it. So, no, I do think Rousseau is seeing himself as a benefactor, both popularly and for those who will be the more, philosophic. And now, I think, though, another thing we're asking is are the philosophic going to undertake something as a group, as a project of some kind?
Particularly, me just as a bit, I become philosophic. I understand. Will I raise my children in a better way, such that they will, in fact, not have to undergo the pain of whatever? I'm trying to get some notion as to whether this is a process that simply has to be redone by everyone in every generation, or whether, in fact, there is some continuity that will push, if not all of humanity forward, then some distinct group.
Oh, I do think he was hoping for some continuity. I think he expected there to be some consequences of his writing for how education is understood. In fact, it did have widespread consequences in Europe and the United States in the reform of education, in rethinking about family life and so forth. I think he thought, though, that to make these reforms, one had to present the satisfaction coming from them, the happiness coming from them, as far more substantial than he thought it really is. All right. All right. And so philosophic life really doesn't, itself doesn't really hinge upon, living or going through the education of Emile. In fact, Rousseau makes quite a lot of the point that Emile is an average person, and one doesn't expect him to become philosophic. Yes, Rousseau did expect to have widespread effects. It's just those were often misinterpreted by, they were misinterpreted by many of the French revolutionaries and others. I mean to say that the effects are different from what historically, the effects he was looking for are different from what historically often occurred. I think I'm answering your question affirmatively, yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Let me announce that the next lecture in the Montesquieu Forum series will be on Monday, March 29th at 4 o'clock, probably in this room. Professor Andrew Norris from the University of California at Santa Barbara will be lecturing on Ridley Scott's movie The Blade Runner and the myth of lost origins. Thank you very much for coming.